And so the idea is if you want to achieve big things, you're actually better off just pursuing things that are interesting. This is true of ourselves and our lives. I think it's true of companies when companies want to innovate and accomplish big things. That random walk, that kind of random mutation that happens is the best way to achieve big objectives. And it's counterintuitive. It's not, again, how we're trained. I've had to unlearn that. That's a really hard lesson. Just go do what's interesting. There's so many examples of that, by the way, people who did that, who just went after things that were interesting to them and tripped into big outcomes.
Welcome to the Unlearn podcast, where host Barry O'Reilly seeks to synthesize the superpowers of extraordinary individuals to think big, start small, and learn fast. Here's your host, Barry O'Reilly.
Welcome to the Unlearn podcast. On this show, I'm delighted to be joined by Elliott Parker, CEO of High Alpha Innovation. Now, High Alpha Innovation partners with corporations, universities, and entrepreneurs to build advantage startups. They apply the venture studio model, developed at High Alpha, with the principles of disruption theory to rapidly build and scale software companies. Previously, Elliott worked in corporate ventures and as an entrepreneur to bring out new ideas to market. He was a consultant at InnoSight, the strategy firm founded by Clayton Christensen, famously of The Innovator's Dilemma and the Theory of Disruption. He's been a founder, investor, advisor, and helped many companies launch, and is passionate about unlocking tangible innovation through engagement between large companies and startups. His book, The Illusion of Innovation, is packed with examples, stories, and experiences of making innovation real. And on this show, we go into those experiences he's had in helping these businesses scale from 0 to 1 and beyond. It's a fascinating show, lots of anecdotes, stories, and examples from Elliott's personal stories. I'm excited to share this. Let's dive into where it got started from. Welcome to the Unlearn podcast. On this show, I'm delighted to be joined by Elliott Parker, CEO of High Alpha Innovation. Now, High Alpha Innovation partners with corporations, universities, and entrepreneurs to build advantage startups. They apply the venture studio model, developed at High Alpha, with the principles of disruption theory to rapidly build and scale software companies. Previously, Elliott worked in corporate ventures and as an entrepreneur to bring out new ideas to market. He was a consultant at InnoSight, the strategy firm founded by Clayton Christensen, famously of The Innovator's Dilemma and the Theory of Disruption. He's been a founder, investor, advisor, and helped many companies launch, and is passionate about unlocking tangible innovation through engagement between large companies and startups. His book, The Illusion of Innovation, is packed with examples, stories, and experiences of making innovation real. And on this show, we go into those experiences he's had in helping these businesses scale from 0 to 1 and beyond. It's a fascinating show, lots of anecdotes, stories, and examples from Elliott's personal stories. I'm excited to share this. Let's dive into where it got started from.
My dad was an entrepreneur, decided to quit his job, a very steady, well-paying job one day, just walked home and announced that he had quit and was starting a new company. And this is back well before internet, anything like that, of course, is back in the 80s. And he grabbed a bedroom in our house and kind of just locked himself in there for about 2 years, a couple phones on a desk, and started a company. And as a kid, it was like, what's he doing in there? How's that work? But he was building a company, and it worked out pretty well. So kind of seeing firsthand entrepreneurship and what it means to build something and to create jobs and opportunity and solve problems for people. Kind of amazing. And I saw that at my grandpa going to the music store, and then on back as far as I can trace, actually, line of entrepreneurs. So my first job out of school, I was working for a company called Arthur Andersen, and I worked in the consulting team. And famously, Arthur Andersen, it's a very well-established 100-year-old company, imploded in about 6 weeks. And I remember driving with my dad in the car and him telling me, a lot of people think big companies are safer and more secure from a job perspective. But the reality is you have no control over your fate when you're working for a big company. You can go work for a small company. You can go start something. Yes, it might fail, but it's up to you. Nobody else determines that for you. And immediately that's for me. I want to control my own fate. I want to build things, and I want to create opportunities. I want to solve important problems, and starting things seemed like a good way to do that.
I love that moment, and what a great bit of advice to have, and especially given from your father. One of the things I've learned about myself over time is that I am not good in big companies, simply because, as you say, the scale, the volume, the amount of people, I always feel like it's hard to really know the impact you're having. And even if you do something or you're contributing towards something, it's such a machine. It's very hard, I feel like, to tie your effort to outcome. And one of the things I've always loved, and even I've left companies as they've got to bigger scale, was this sort of real touching and feeling like the contribution you're making, the teams that you're part of, and seeing your work connect with customers, connect with people that you're building, or the company changing as a result, was something that always, I didn't realize how much it mattered to me until I started to have experiences doing that. Because I started in a startup, and then the last sort of real company I worked for was a company called ThoughtWorks, that they were sort of pioneered the agile software development movement. And I remember when I joined, there was like 4 offices, maybe. There was like maybe 150 people in the world. And it was such a great melting pot of interesting characters. But the company then, it worked out, it started to grow. But there was definitely moments, as I felt a couple of years into it, that I was like, it's becoming really hard to, move at the speed that we want. And then the things I like don't work in this world anymore because I've got to go to like a committee to organize something, to do something. And it was killing me. And ultimately, that's when I had this aha of like, actually, I'm better in earlier, smaller things that are like 0 to 1 or whatever that might be. So tell us like how you sort of took that a bit of aha moment and then started to apply it. Like, what was the next thing you did or the next few things you did to sort of double down on that sense of, I want to have this sense of control is one word, but like impact, I would think, and tying it to it.
Yeah, impact. Immediately after that conversation with my dad, a few months later, I was in business school. I don't know if going to business school is the best way to learn how to be an entrepreneur, but for me, it opened a lot of doors. I mean, the most important thing I learned in business school was that none of the buildings were named after investment bankers or consultants. They were all named after entrepreneurs who had done well and donated back to their alma mater. That may be the most important lesson from business school. I loved my experience. I'd do it again, but I'm a huge admirer of large corporations and the people who lead them. But I'm with you. I am not wired that way to do that. I'm not a very good employee. There's a scene, one of my favorite movies is Ford versus Ferrari. It is the best movie, hands down, about innovation because it sets it up perfectly. You have Ford, which is this massive corporation, and then you have Shelby, that's this startup out in California, and the two are trying to collaborate to beat Ferrari in the race. There's 2 scenes that explain the difference really well between corporations and startups. There's one scene where the Shelby team shows up at the racetrack to test the car that they were working on with Ford. And the Ford team has put this incredibly expensive, heavy computer in the passenger seat of the car. And the Shelby guys show up, like, they're going to drive this car on the track for that computer. They throw the computer out of the car, and then they take a ribbon and tape it on the outside so they can watch the airflow over the cars going around the track. Super inexpensive, quick, easy. And then there's another scene in the movie where Carroll Shelby and Henry Ford III are up in Henry Ford's office looking out on the Ford factories. And Henry Ford says during World War II, these factories were converted within a matter of weeks to produce a good number of the airplanes that the Allies used to win World War II. So here's a great example of something that a corporation can do that Shelby and a startup could never do. And so both do things uniquely well. And the economy needs both to thrive. These laptops that we're talking to each other on across the world, built by a corporation. Startup couldn't do this, couldn't master the supply chains. And so I'm wired for starting things the 0 to 1 stage. That's just how my brain works. But I am a huge admirer of large corporations. I think that the limited liability corporation is actually one of the greatest inventions in the history of mankind. It's a little bit of a contrarian view. But the idea that we can come together with a piece of paper and make promises to each other how we're going to behave, and that can be propagated out to like 100,000 or more people working together in a corporation all around these promises on a piece of paper. That's crazy that works. It did not have to be that way. And we need vehicles like that as people to be able to collaborate together. Corporations are an amazing thing. So I'm a huge admirer of all those who do their best to lead these large corporations and recognize how difficult it is as well. Really, really hard.
So a lot of the focus of the book is this idea of the illusion of innovation. You've obviously seen it in both of these styles of companies, right? Big, small, early, more established. What were some of your lessons that you had to unlearn, maybe as you started to become a leader in some of these businesses? What were some of the things that started to stood out to you on your experience where maybe they'd made you successful in the past, but when you tried to apply them then in these new domains, that secret sauce maybe stopped working, or you had to sort of evolve yourself?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's such a great idea. The idea that we have to unlearn things to unlock new pathways of growth. It reminds me, actually, there's a story. I'll come back to your question saying there's a story in my book about Hafthor Bjornsson. He's this guy who holds the world record for the heaviest power lift. Guy's amazing. He's like 6'10". Those who, your listeners, use the imperial system, was 2 meters plus, right? He's amazingly enormous guy. And there's a guy in England who did hold the world's record for heaviest deadlift, 500 kilos. And this guy, Thor Bjornsson, didn't like that guy. Decided he was going to beat him by a single kilo. And he prepared for I can't remember, 2 years or something, where he was lifting, putting his body through rigorous workouts, eating 5 meals a day, full meals to gain the weight and the muscle. At the time he did the lift, he weighed 450 pounds himself. And the lift was so strenuous, he succeeded, got the world record, done something nobody had ever done before in the history of humanity. Amazing. But the lift was so strenuous, when he was done, he was bleeding from his eye sockets. That's insane. It's amazing what people will do to accomplish something. And it's a reminder to me that big things don't come easy. He had to put his body under tremendous stress and tension and pressure to be able to pull that off. And so this idea of unlearning things is really important. You've got to push yourself to challenge what you think is true, to uncover new anomalies and surprises. I used to work with a guy named Clayton Christensen, who's pretty well known in the world of innovation, right? Came up with the idea of disruptive innovation. And outside his office at the Harvard Business School, there was a sign that he hung that he made that said anomalies wanted. And there was nothing he loved more than somebody walking into his office and challenging one of his theories with some bit of data that seemed to go against what the theory would have predicted, because it was that clash that made the theory stronger. There's a couple of things that I think of when I think of what I've had to unlearn over the years. 2 big lessons. One comes from my interactions with Clay Christensen, who near the end of his life was telling people about this idea of what he called the capitalist dilemma. The idea that we have decided as a society that the most important metric for determining the success of a company is return on invested capital, and applied over quarterly or annual time periods. And as a result, what has happened is that companies, large corporations, have become incredibly efficient. They're optimized to achieve a high ROIC, return on invested capital. As a result, corporations have more money on their balance sheets than ever before. And at the same time, they're also more fragile. More money on their balance sheets, and also less capable of innovating and confronting big challenges and opportunities. And Clay tied it directly to this idea of return on invested capital. Everything I'd been taught in undergrad business school was about the importance of generating free cash flow in businesses. And here was Clay saying that may not be the most important metric. And I remember asking, well, what else? What is? How do we measure company success? And his answer was, I don't know yet. We don't know the other metric. But I don't think this is it. I don't think this is the right way to do it, because it leads companies to make mistakes, to focus on the short term, to build things that don't endure, and to emphasize cash and return to shareholders over the needs of other stakeholders many times. So that, for me, I'm still unlearning that and trying to figure out, how do we measure the success of companies that it's not at? The book I wrote, actually, in fact, is in part my attempt to try and identify other ways to measure success of companies. Then the second thing I learned actually while writing the book, a friend of mine named Ken Stanley wrote an amazing book that changed how I think about the world. His book is called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. Ken's an AI researcher. And what he was doing in his research was they built a tool that enabled people to work with images on a computer screen. So what the tool would do is it would generate 16 blobs on a computer screen. And as a user interacting with this, you select the most interesting blob. And what this computer program would then do is generate descendants from that blob, another 16. And you keep doing this over generations until the pictures actually start to become something interesting. And if you do this over 30, 40 generations, the blobs might evolve into something that looks like a race car or the Eiffel Tower or something. And they thought this is really interesting, that you can go from random blobs to an image just by selecting what's interesting. And so they tried to train a computer to do the same thing. They said, here's a picture of an Eiffel Tower that somebody else generated going through this process. We want you, computer, to come up with the Eiffel Tower. And they'd have to shut the program down, if I remember right, after 30, 40,000 generations, because the computer was striving to achieve that objective rather than just picking what was interesting along the way. And striving to achieve that objective inevitably would fail. And the lesson for us in our lives, in our companies, is that actually in setting these lofty objectives, it actually, you look at the data, we're less likely to achieve them by the sheer fact that we're setting those objectives and working toward them. You give us the example in the book as well. If you went back 150 years and wanted to invent the microwave oven, you could go tell people, well, we've got these things in the future called microwaves, and they're amazing. You can cook anything, and it does it really fast, and here's how it works. Someone would have sat down with that goal to design the microwave oven. They never would have arrived at it, because along the way, there are all these incremental inventions that from totally unrelated fields that were necessary. They had to be discovered almost through haphazard random walk. And so the idea is, if you want to achieve big things, you're actually better off just pursuing things that are interesting. This is true of ourselves and our lives. I think it's true of companies when companies want to innovate and accomplish big things. That random walk, that kind of random mutation that happens, is the best way to achieve big objectives. And it's counterintuitive. It's not, again, how we're trained. I've had to unlearn that. That's a really hard lesson. Just go do what's interesting. There's so many examples of that, by the way. People who did that, who just went after things that were interesting to them and tripped into big outcomes.
So look, there's loads of great things to unpack there. Like yourself, I had the pleasure to meet Clay Christensen probably just a year before he passed away. He did an event together in San Diego. And to be honest, it was a bit of a highlight for me just to even stand in the same room as the guy. As tall as he was, I was still like towering above me, but it was like just fascinating to hear him speak. But one of the lessons I just heard you share there was this ability to put your ideas out there and encourage critique to make them better, I think is a really important lesson about raising the bar and the quality and the robustness of your ideas. But I also really love this idea that you're talking about of typically us thinking about you have to have these big audacious goals. Like we're all told you have to have big, bold objectives and big returns. And yet most of the most amazing breakthroughs have been people following their intellectual curiosity or pursuit that is something that is fascinating to them. And as you say, there's so many examples of folks that when they just sort of hit a vein of something that excites them and their ability to just keep working on that problem to sort of scratch the itch of it is where they get some of these amazing breakthroughs. You mentioned it in the book as well, and it was also one thing that came to mind to me as you were talking about it is Jeff Bezos has this huge propensity for, I guess he calls it pottering, like to wander. These are things I think sometimes people don't hear. It's not the conventional guidance, right? The conventional guidance is, no, you set a big, massive goal. It's 100% retention from customers in the next 5 years, and you just go to work like driving towards that thing, right? And that versus this notion of wandering and finding these sort of random walks, finding these nuggets that drive your curiosity and your passion for a domain, and then the pursuit in solving that. It's a pleasure, it's a game, it's a reward in itself, just like digging into the topic. I think if anyone's ever found a topic that they suddenly just got very interested in and just had a thirst to learn more, I feel like it's sort of trying to tap into more of that philosophy than someone told me I needed to get like 10 times faster when I sprinted or grow my company 10 times bigger. So what have been some of the ways you've embraced that mentality? You are a venture builder and you're building lots of companies. So how do you sort of instill that into some of the teams that you've worked with, like to actually say to them, it's okay not to have an objective. Let's go explore. Let's wander. Let's take a random walk. Because, I'm sure investors are sitting there panicking going, hang on a sec, like just tell people they can go for a walk. Like what the hell?
Yeah, it's super counterintuitive. Let me give you a real world example of this that may be my favorite example. And then I'll come back to how we are applying that in our organization, High Alpha Innovation. Walt Disney was an amazing guy. He created this whole industry of animation. This idea that you could produce full-length movies with animated characters was pretty revolutionary when he did it. He did it quite successfully. And after a bit of time, had a lot of competitors. And coming out of World War II, he repurposed his studio to make some propaganda movies for the government. Coming out of World War II, found a situation where there's all these competitors making animated movies. And it was really hard for him to do it at the quality he wanted to do in a way that made economic sense, because all these competitors were out there doing it less expensively and making an inferior product, but getting a foothold in the market. And so he got kind of frustrated and bored with the business. He was kind of stressed out. And one of his assistants suggested that he go to Chicago with a friend to a train exposition. So hopped on a train, rode the train from California to Chicago, went to this thing and came away absolutely fascinated by trains and railroads. And he went back to LA, back to California, and got some of the studio workers and convinced them to work with him to help start building model trains at the studio, and became so obsessed with model trains, he actually moved his family to a new house where it had a yard, where in the yard they could build a model train that you could ride on. So he started to reorient his whole life around this. And at the time, there was a critic at the New York Times who said it's an absolute shame. I mean, this man was a genius of entertainment, and he's kind of lost his mind. All he thinks about and does these days is work on tinker with model trains. And how people thought he'd gone crazy. But he was fascinated by these trains. And pretty soon he started building little miniature sets with his trains, little villages and towns. And he thought these were so neat, other people might want to see them. And he started touring these around the country. And people would pay money to come see his little villages that he built. And he called these things Disneylandia. And it's hard to know exactly where along the way, but somewhere along the way, the idea popped into his head to go recreate the amusement park industry, build Disneyland in Southern California. When I was growing up in Southern California, we could see the fireworks from Disneyland out our window of our house at night. So always felt a special connection to that place. But here he was, by going on this random thing where people thought he lost his mind, he, along the way, learned about rides. He learned about creating scenes and experiences. And he combined that with his ability to tell stories and created a whole new industry around amusement parks simply because he's chasing his curiosity. So there are a lot of examples of that. You think a lot of big innovations that came, they were almost through random acts of just serendipity. Well, my view is that you can actually manufacture serendipity if you do it right. This is particularly true inside of large corporations that have the means to do something like this. So we built High Alpha Innovation specifically to work with corporations to build startups as a way to help those corporations access innovation by pursuing things that seem interesting but difficult to do inside the walls of the corporation. But my entire business is actually built around this idea that by pursuing novelty and things that are interesting, these corporations are more likely to find anomalies, like Clay Christensen said, and to tap into new pathways for growth that otherwise would have been impossible. Think about when we set big visions, to your point, hey, we want to grow revenue by $5 billion next year. Or the US government famously in the 1960s said, we're going to launch the war on cancer, the war on poverty. Well, we're still fighting that war. You set those really big objectives, you're actually less likely to achieve them. By doing things that seem interesting, you stumble into new ways to solve problems. You discover anomalies and surprises. Big corporations are really good at execution. They're really bad at learning. Startups are really good at learning, and they're pretty bad at execution.
Yeah.
So if you can combine the two of those, actually, I think society's better off. A lot of corporations look at what startups are doing and think, well, we need to act more like a startup. That is a terrible idea. Most startups go out of business.
Yeah.
But corporations can leverage that learning ability of startups if structured appropriately. I think it's a great way to run experiments that challenge the status quo, that are likely to uncover anomalies that lead us to question the way things are, what we believe about the organization, the way our market works, the way the world works.
Yeah, no, it's a good way to think about now, in a way, like what do you see almost at an industry level that needs to be unlearned, right? Because that is a very classic picture people paint, a big enterprise is saying, we want to innovate like a startup. And, the truth of a startup is if it's successful, it hopefully will become an enterprise at some level, right? It will grow. And, so you do have this sort of grass is greener and we need to be more like them and they need to be more like you. But there's another one of the really important ideas in your book where you talk about, you said it as learning, but I think you define it as knowledge compounds in the book. That, I think, is a really important sort of insight for folks that, the greatest thing in the world, obviously, is compound interest, and closely followed by that is compound learning, let's call it. So talk a little bit about what was your aha there, especially in this guise now of the work that you're doing to help these, as you say, businesses get better at exploring, get better at running experiments to figure out what are the anomalies or that they're looking for that could actually yield huge benefits for them. It all reliance on the currency being less ROI, but more the information you're gathering and what you do with it.
As you know, in the world of venture capital is what's called a power law asset class, meaning if you draw out the curve, it's not a standard deviation curve like public equities are, where you can go almost at random, choose 25, 30 public equities to invest in. You're going to achieve more or less an average market return. In a power law asset class, one or two things produce the bulk of returns, and then you have a very long tail of things that produce little or no return. That's how venture capital works. And so the goal when you're dealing with a power law asset class is to have as broad a portfolio as possible. You want to make investments in as many things as you can and try and spread your bets around, because it's really hard to predict ahead of time which investments are going to be those winners that produce the power law returns. And what I realized over time is that insights in a very similar way are a power law asset class. You think about the role of an executive in a large company or someone in particular who's driving innovation for a large company. Their goal is to gather insights on behalf of that corporation. The challenge is that the corporation is optimized for very efficient functioning. Try to remove any sense of error. We try to make things as predictable and safe as possible. And so it's actually really hard to gather insights in that type of environment because you're not making the mistakes that turn up the insights that lead you to discover those anomalies. And so we end up with too few, or making bets in insights that we think we predict ahead of time are going to be the things that matter. We just can't tell. So the idea is you want to gather as many insights as you can, because you can't predict ahead of time which insights are going to be those power laws and which ones are going to be the duds. It's really hard to know. So you just want to gather as many insights as you can. And you do that by running experiments that challenge the status quo, challenge your existing beliefs, that uncover anomalies. The best experiments lead to more experiments. Often inside of corporations, because we're so optimized for safety, predictability, we may be running experiments, but they're actually things that are designed to reinforce what we know or hope is still true about the world rather than challenge, because that's scary. Startups, on the other hand, have nothing to preserve, right? They're designed to go figure out what's new, to go pounce on anomalies, pounce on weak signals, and see if we can pry these open and turn them into bigger things. So the goal for, I think, leaders of any large organization, or small organizations for that matter, is to figure out, how are you managing your insights portfolio? And is it broad enough? Are you generating the types of a broad enough portfolio of insights that you're likely to achieve the power law returns that you're going to need to uncover new pathways for growth?
I love what you're sharing, right? It's funny, there's almost shades of this idea that you have to take what's sacred and challenge it. Just like your Clay Christian an example about his theory, he welcomed people that would find, again, ways to challenge the thinking because it makes it more robust. And in a way, when you're thinking about a portfolio, you almost want to challenge the existing thesis of the company. Is there things we could be doing that are way out there that we should try? Everything about a corporation somewhat inhibits you. You've annual planning. There's only maybe 2 or 3 bets you can make a year. And then the pressure for that bet to work from a return on investment point of view, rather than just let's make a small bet and see what we learn here, and then we'll make another bet and another bet. And doing this simultaneously and in parallel, right, to create optionality is such a important part. But everything in corporations is designed not to let people make lots of small bets and let things come to a conclusion that is not necessarily a monetary return. It's an insight, as you say. So what are some of the things you do to help businesses then start that? Because many people will be listening to the show going, yeah, that's it. That's the thing I need to do.
What do I do tomorrow?
But my boss is, my boss don't let me, or annual planning. Like most people are, we're sort of end of Q1, Q2 here. Most people are probably just finishing their roadmap for the year now and getting it signed off, and if they're lucky, there's like 3 experiments they're able to run this year, and they better work. Otherwise, there's no experiment budget next year. So,
and maybe no job.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are like some of the things you can help people with just getting started as they try to bring this philosophy and systems into their company?
So yeah, for most people, it would be a bad idea tomorrow to go into work and tell your CFO that you want to spend all your time playing with trains. Walt Disney was in a unique situation to be able to do that. Well, let me give you an analogy, a way to think about it. A few years ago, I had the amazing opportunity to go down to the Amazon, the Peruvian Amazon, South America, with my son, who's now in grad school, learning to be an entomologist, studying insects. We went down to the Amazon jungle specifically to look for insects, which at the time I was, the things we do for our kids, right?
Yeah, he's like, I found trains, Dad. You should check this stuff
Yeah,
out.
exactly.
Sure, I'll go have a look.
Well, exactly. And that's exactly right. This trip turned out to be life-changing for me. It was amazing. We went down there to find bugs at night. What we would do with our guide is set up a white bed sheet between two trees and then shine a light on the bed sheet. And within minutes, it would be covered with insects of every possible variety, many that maybe the majority of which had never been cataloged before. Every different color, appendages, camouflages, some that look like sticks, leaves, bright colors, just amazing variety. And what we were looking at the time was the fruit of an innovation system, if you want to think about it that way. The Amazon jungle is incredibly resilient because of the way that it innovates. Think about this particular part of the Amazon where we were over the eons has remained relatively unchanged, like a 60 square mile area. A lot of the rest of the Amazon has dried out, got wet, and so on. This particular spot, for whatever reason, has stayed the same. And so more varieties of monkeys, birds, insects in this little part of the Amazon than maybe anywhere else on the planet. Amazing to see the variety and the way that the innovation happens inside that system. Number one, it's at the level of individual cells or organisms in that ecosystem, right? Where if the mutation fails, it's too bad for the organism, but the ecosystem is totally fine. On the other hand, if that mutation succeeds, the ecosystem is poised to grab it and propagate it. That mutation is not top down, it's not communicated, it's not objectives driven. It is influenced by constraints. There's only so much air and water and sunlight, food. So there are constraints. I'll come back to that in a second, but there are no objectives. It's a random walk like we talked about, just finding the next most interesting thing. If you evolve enough times, you'll trip into this idea that there's light, and having eyeballs is a good way to perceive the light, right? You will uncover new ways of operating. So it's not top down. It's also not communicated broadly. There's no centralized communication network where that the innovation is shared, or organisms have to approve.
Yeah.
The thing about in every single
meetings every quarter to sign off on will we let this entity exist?
Like, no, that's too crazy of a mutation. No, right? You imagine in every imaginable way that the Amazon jungle innovates is the complete opposite of what we do in our organizations. Inside our organizations, it is top down. It's not at the margins, at the edges of cells or organisms. It's centralized. So whether it succeeds or fails, it's extra expensive. It's communicated at every step along the way, getting approvals and making sure everyone's aligned and on board. Terrible idea when you're dealing with transformative innovation, it turns out. And the Amazon's incredibly resilient as a result. So when I think about innovation inside of large organizations, it needs to be pursued. And so in a similar way, we can learn a lot from nature. Think about making it the edges at the level of organisms. What's the equivalent of the organism or the cell in a corporation? In my mind, in business, that's what a startup is. And actually, if you can push that startup outside the corporation altogether, now you can fund that thing differently. It's not an operating expense anymore. It is a balance sheet investment where that capital investment can be patient, better aligned to the timelines over which that thing needs to operate. The goal for that, to the extent there's a goal, is to learn and develop optionality to figure out new ways of doing things. Not to add more revenue to the corporation in the next year. Building new ventures is a terrible way to add revenue to a corporation. So many corporations I interact with, maybe $50 billion a year corporation, we want to grow by 10% next year, and we want half of that to come from new ventures we build. That's a ridiculous idea.
Yeah.
You're talking about building Google next year, and usually it's with a team of people doing it part-time and minimal investment. That's not going to happen. So rather to run these experiments at the margins, learn from them, and then use the lever of your $50 billion corporation and take that from 50 to 55 rather than something new from 0 to 5 billion. Don't communicate it. Don't share it along the way. Don't make it top down. Use constraints. And so the best way I've learned to do this, what I see is Organizations, corporations can push their innovation much farther outside the organization than they typically do. The normal response and strategy is to set up an innovation team, give them some budget, let them go a little bit wild, wear jeans to work, whatever. And you could be outside the corporation a little bit. Every corporation does this, and it's not a bad thing. Those types of teams are really well positioned to drive incremental innovation. But over 30 years of watching these teams do that type of thing, I cannot think of any really meaningful example of success where a team like that has helped drive fundamental transformation in the business model of a corporation. I think that's telling because every corporation does it, and nobody can think of good examples of it actually working to produce the transformation that everybody hopes for. Lots of incremental improvements along the way, right? Not transformation. So push it out much farther, learn from the Amazon jungle, do it at the level of sales and startups outside the corporation, fund it appropriately without all the communication involvement of the core distraction to the core business.
These are fantastic stories that you're able to share to help people land these, somewhat non-obvious methods and tactics that are really important to do what they want to do well. So looking forward for you then, what are you most excited about? You're in one of these unique positions. High Alpha is a fantastic studio doing amazing work. Even the studio story of itself, how it's evolved, and you've created all these different groups from funds to corporate entities to it's just a fascinating story as well. What are you excited about yourself as you look forward in this space?
Yeah, I'm really excited about the scale that we're achieving. So back in 2020, I took a couple of people from our High Alpha team and spun out, created this High Alpha Innovation to go explore what would it look like to build startups with corporations and to go launch more venture studios. One of the questions we want to answer is what would it look like to launch 100 companies a year? Back to the power law thing, right? What would need to be true for us to launch 100 companies a year rather than the 4 or 5 you can do in a typical studio? Well, we'd need more partners. We need better access to ideas and understanding of problems. And we found that working with corporations is a great way to do that. So I am really excited about the scale that we're achieving. We'll launch somewhere, maybe 15 companies this year, each of those with a corporation or university as a partner. And as we map it out to the year after 25, and it just grows. And I'm excited about that because of the impact that I think it can have, not only on the lives of the people involved in those companies that we're launching, but the problems that we're solving. We're going after really big, meaty, important problems. And in some cases, startups are the best way where there's a lot of ambiguity. These little startups are a great way to go try and figure out new solutions. And I am so pumped about that. We've got some coming, just doing radically different approaches to these issues. I've got a team right now running a sprint week, looking at a couple of ideas for addressing poverty through for-profit ventures, taking totally different approaches to these really meaty problems. I can't wait to see, 10 years from now, we model it out, and maybe we've got 500 startups in the portfolio that we've launched through this approach. And I think that's going to have a pretty important impact on corporations and universities. We partner with people working in these companies as well as society, and we're at the problems that we have to solve.
No doubt there's another book in there, Elliott, when you get to that point. It's been super to have you on the show. Thank you so much for sort of sharing so many great stories as well to help people really get their grasp of these ideas and why they're important. And it's a fantastic book, The Illusion of Innovation. I highly recommend people read it. It's a very easy read as well. It's just this podcast has been packed with stories and examples. So thank you very much for sharing. And yeah, I look forward to having you back in a couple of years' time. And let's dive into what you've learned at that point too as well.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. Yeah, lots for all of us to unlearn. So I'm grateful for the chance to be on the podcast and great discussion.
Our pleasure. Thanks.
Hey everyone. I hope you enjoyed that show, but I'm even more delighted to share the exciting news. I've recently co-founded a new venture studio named Nobody Studios. Now, Venture Studio is a vehicle for the rapid creation of new companies, from ideation to acceleration and growth. And our purpose at Nobody Studios will be to de-risk pre-seed stage business ideas. We'll do this by minimizing the time, speed, and capital involved in validating truly repeatable and scalable business models before any significant venture investment. We've an audacious goal to start 100 compelling companies over the next 5 years, and who knows how many beyond that. So if you're interested in radically changing the way work is done, how products are created, companies built and funded, even democratizing the wealth creation and how returns are distributed, this could be the business for you. We're looking for talent, capital, and influence. If you wish to contribute any or all of these, just get in touch. You can follow us on nobodystudios.com, on our LinkedIn page, all the social media accounts, or simply my newsletters and what I'm sharing. We'll be launching a truly innovative crowdfunding campaign, and I'd be honored if you'd be willing to join us on this journey and become a nobody yourself.